Welcome to the Architectural Technologist Podcast. Really pleased to have you with me. I really appreciate you giving up your time to be with us today. You and I have met before, and I know that you did your early education where I used to teach. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your career, how it started, what you thought about it, where you worked, because you've worked in some really fantastic places, and I'd love to hear how that journey developed.
Yeah, kia ora, Ethan and Jonathan.
Right.
Thanks for having me on first. Yeah, I did. I started my study at EIT back in 2006, actually. And since then, I went on to do a Bachelor of Engineering and Technology.
So you did EIT, you did the Bachelor of Building Engineering Technology.
Yeah, worked at Warren and Mahoney Architects for 15 years, starting off as a technician and then following the trends in digital development and moving into a role that you would call sort of a BIM coordinator. But back in 2014, we were really still discovering what BIM actually was. From there, I moved into more of a role around internal digital transformation, which is looking at how we can take a firm like Warren and Mahoney, 300 people strong, and bring them into the digital age. Because one thing that we've learned is that as companies get bigger, they get a lot slower in terms of that adoption of change. And interestingly enough, Warren and Mahoney, where I previously worked, is a leader in digital technology now, but we're actually one of the latest in New Zealand to adopt it just because of the nature of investment and retraining and building up that knowledge in-house. And so a lot of my role between 2014 to 2020 was really around leading that change.
I was interested, you said that you did a Bachelor of Building and Engineering Technology. That's after you've done your Diploma of Architectural Technology. So were you working for Warren and Mahoney at that time that you did that Bachelor?
No, I wasn't. So it's an interesting story, actually. I'm from Waiwa in Hawke's Bay. My parents live in Mahia. I left high school with the intention of moving to Wellington and studying that Bachelor of Engineering and Technology that we talked about. What ended up happening was it was a really big shift. Coming from a small town, moving to a big city like that, I found it really overwhelming. I missed my friends. I didn't really quite know where I fit in a big city like that. And so after my first year, I actually stepped back from that study and relocated somewhere a little bit closer to home. And that's where I joined EIT. So I actually transferred my first year of study from Massey over to EIT, and I went straight into that second year. It was also the first year that Massey were offering this course, and they were still trying to figure it out. And it felt like they had some assessments that were way too hard. That's others that were trivial. And I felt like I didn't really want to be the guinea pig for a new course. So I moved into the student village in Taradale. I studied at EIT for a year. And after I completed that diploma, I then went back to Massey to finish off my studies there after the first batch of students had gone through and they'd started to refine the course.
So you went straight from EIT back to Massey and completed your Bachelor?
Yeah, more or less. I did try and find a bit of work in between, but for those of us that are old enough, they'll remember that 2007, 2008, not a great time for finding jobs. So if the opportunity it came about, maybe I would have gone straight into work. Given the situation that we were in with finding work, I decided to go back and complete another 2 years of study. And the actual intention was to do a further year of study to do a postgraduate diploma in teaching, because when I started the study, I really intended to be a technology teacher or a calculus and physics teacher at secondary school. Before I could do that, I had to complete 300 hours work experience to get accepted. I did that at a small firm in Taradale and Greenmeadows called Garripit Architects. I think they go under a different name now. While I was there, I decided, actually, you know what, I really enjoy this. And I stuck with it for 15 years. But at the time, I was starting to miss Wellington. So there was that transition, going to Wellington the first time, feeling intimidated, overwhelmed, and wanting to really crawl back to something that was a little more comfortable. When I was in a place that was a little more comfortable, I actually realized how much I missed the city and I missed Wellington, and I wanted to be back there. And so I've been back here ever since, going on 20 years now.
So how did the Bachelor of Building and Engineering help you get your work at Warren and Mahoney?
The degree helped in the sense that it showed that I can set myself a task, I can complete it, and I can complete it to an acceptable level. Just any degree or any diploma can. It also gave me the opportunity to learn a lot of the software that we use. It gave me the tools to think critically, to apply research and investigate different ways of doing things. My thesis at Massey University was on robotics in the construction industry, so quite far ahead of its time. I was looking at how the future of technology might change construction sites. So it basically gave me the opportunity to find those areas of interest to me that were starting to show up in the market. Now, of course, the role that I would eventually move into didn't exist at the time that I was studying, but it also allowed me to adapt and to analyze change in the industry and move with it.
Interesting.
The reality is 95% of what I needed to know, you learn when you're in that first year of employment. The most important thing that you can get from university or from Polytech or from your studies is just learning to engage with new information as it comes to you and being a sponge and trying to learn everything you can from every person around you and every resource around you. So I think that's my big takeaway from my years of study, was training myself to be able to do that.
I've often said that the first bachelor qualification is learning how to learn, learning how to research, learning how to think.
Exactly.
And so it really doesn't matter what you do as long as you learn those things, because in our construction industry, it's constantly changing. It seems to be changing faster now than when I first started. We've got new materials coming on board all the time, and you often need to be able to look at those materials and do your analysis on them and decide whether or not you're using the right material. And then, of course, we got BIM. We'll talk about BIM later, hopefully. The change in that and the information that's coming out, we need to be able to digest that, use it again. So you've got all this stuff. You've gone to Warren and Mahoney and you've started it as a technician. So it must have been a massive change to go from just technician through to this changing this corporate structure or changing the culture.
When you say it like that, yeah.
But it is a change of culture internally to get them to start thinking about BIM as a fundamental part of their design process.
Yep.
I went to Christchurch recently and I saw Miles Warren's old house, and you can imagine that was all done on drawing, tracing paper. Now we need to move into a world which is completely different. But I think there's also a different way of thinking about that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to a little bit of that. My first few years at Warren and Mahoney, yes, it was still using 2D CAD. We had a tool called MicroStation, which was a little bit different to AutoCAD, but similar in a lot of ways. And BIM was starting to be talked about internationally, and there were some major projects that were starting to be delivered. So all the software providers, Revit, Archicad, all the rest are starting to talk about BIM from that perspective. Basically, what happened was there were a series of projects that started to be introduced in New Zealand that had BIM components within their bids. So if you are bidding for this work, you also have to be able to showcase that you can follow a BIM process, because that's required in order to win the work. So it became mandatory that we had to upscale. For me, in the Wellington studio, we were working on a project for Victoria University called Te Toki Arata. It was their bioscience and research building. It was a brand new building. It was huge and very complicated. It had to be built with an active road cutting through the middle of the site that had to remain active for the entirety of the build process, because it was an ambulance and fire service vehicle route. And so we had to implement a series of digital tools to manage that. And we started down a pathway with ACOSIM 3D, which is a Bentley tool. We started on the process of learning ACOSIM 3D and seeing what their BIM offering was. We ended up at the end of preliminary design. I went to my project architect at the time and I said, look, I think we should pivot to Revit. I think that we're not going to be able to deliver this project the way we're expected to using these tools, and Revit seems to be where the majority of the industry is moving. If I can get the project back to where it is at the end of preliminary design in 2 weeks using Revit, can we just continue forward with Revit? So it was a pretty bold suggestion, but he agreed. He gave me the opportunity to rebuild the model, to rebuild the documentation. So it was flat out for 2 weeks. And that was basically my kickstart into digital transformation, if you will, because I had to learn it fast enough to be the person that could support the rest of the team in implementing it. It was a pivotal moment because if we'd stuck with Sim, I would have actually been among the last to have made that transition into Revit. But by being ambitious and throwing myself in the mix, I was actually among the first. And of course, we also employed some expertise. Jason Howden, who some of your audience might know, is one of our industry leaders here in terms of BIM and actually bringing BIM to New Zealand in the first place. And some of my colleagues, Natalie Jacks and others who had recently come back from overseas with Revit experience. So between us, we carried the Wellington studio forward in terms of implementing new software, and the processes that would follow would include some of those BIM processes that were required by the client.
That's a pretty bold thing to do. It takes an awful lot of guts to make that jump. But there must have been something that you were seeing in the background saying this Bentley system is not going to be doing what we want to. Maybe it was those people coming back from overseas and you were looking and saying, I see this coming.
Bentley owned the horizontal space. When we're talking BIM and we're talking about civil and transport and all of that, that's really powerful there. But for the vertical space for buildings, the market was heading towards Revit. The Tokyo Data wasn't the first project at Warren and Mahoney to use Revit. We had the Justice Precinct in Christchurch. We had the Hotel Grand Chancellor. So there were a couple of projects that were already going up. So inevitably we would be heading that way because the practice had already made the strategic decision to pivot towards Revit. It was just, for me, I wanted to be part of that first wave. And if you work on projects the scale that I worked on, these projects consume you for 3 to 4 years. So I wanted to be going in now in 2013, not in 2017.
Is there anything else you want to talk about with your career development at Warren and Mahoney?
Yeah, I guess so. I think after that first wave, digital innovation became a big part of large-scale architecture firms. So from that initial jump into the deep end with Revit and BIM, my role then changed into an internal digital enablement role where I was able to form a team. We grew and we expanded and we brought the entire practice up to speed. The role then changes, and this is something that might be interesting to students if they're listening, is this role didn't exist. But for me, a young technician or draftsman, to move into this role is really interesting. My role became keeping up with the industry. What are all the new software vendors doing? What are all the new digital processes that will make us more efficient, make us more capable, make us more technically capable? What risk do they introduce? What risk do they solve? What's the apex essentially of what we can expect people to learn and keep learning while still delivering their work? So it became a strategic role where I wasn't really on specific projects anymore. I was more spread across all projects with the help of the team, identifying areas where we could improve or course correcting where we felt like our teams needed some support to get them in the right direction. It's an interesting role that you can only really do at large scale firms because they're the only firms that kind of have that fat to support those kind of roles.
So what could people learn while still producing their work? Interesting.
Yeah. What kind of capacity do they have?
Because when you see people working hard, often their ability to learn new things is very limited because there's so much they need to get out that they already know, trying to get them to work in different ways. And I've been in that role, and it can be challenging trying to get them to learn the new technology when what they're really interested in is getting the work out.
Yeah, but you can make it interesting and engaging, and then it doesn't feel like a chore to learn something new, to stay up to date. People who are really proud of their work do work that they're proud of. And so if you can provide someone with a tool that enables them to do that better or more efficiently or easier or get more out of it, they're far more willing to engage with it. If you're going to someone and saying it's not good enough, you need to do this because what you're producing isn't enough, then what you're essentially putting in front of them is a barrier that they have to overcome in order to be the person that you need them to be. That approach doesn't work very well. It's better to build them up and set them on a path than telling them that they need to do it because that's the only way they're going to stay good enough.
It sounds like you became a teacher in the end.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it's funny. found myself gravitating back towards teaching. I onboarded over 300 people in my time at WAM. So that's the equivalent to our entire headcount currently. I wrote all of our training material. I created our learning management system where people could go on and they could go through courses that I'd written and recorded. Yeah. In an odd way, I did end up becoming a teacher, just in a different format.
So you also did some TED Talks.
I did do a TED Talk.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So that was a lot of fun. Probably the most intense 5 weeks of my life. So for those that are unfamiliar, there's TED, which is the kind of the main platform, and then there's TEDx, which is the TED experience. So that's a license that cities can essentially acquire the rights to, and it allows them to run their own TED events within their city. So you have TEDx Wellington, TEDx Auckland, or Melbourne, or Vancouver, or wherever it is. And they come about once every 2 years. I always really loved listening to TED Talks. You're a junior technician, you're drawing details all day, you've got your headphones on, you're either listening to music or you're listening to podcasts. And there was this podcast called the TED Radio Hour that they put out once a week. And it was snippets from a bunch of TED Talks and TEDx Talks. And I used to just find that so engaging and interesting. And I'd always go down these rabbit holes. So when I saw they were advertising for one in Wellington, I really have to get on board and put in an application for that. So basically, you submit a 3-minute video where you introduce yourself, you introduce your topic, and you talk about why you think you'd be a good person to have on the TEDx stage. So I did that. I presented this idea that was all about technology and architecture. We're on the precipice of so much change with construction robotics, with AI, with digital tools. We can do so much now with data. We can calculate the carbon costs of buildings before they're built, and we can use that to inform design. We can design buildings that can foster better mental health and better well-being and things like that. And so it was this talk about change, digital change, and how awesome that's going to be, but also how do we keep up? How do we manage it all? And usually what happens is the idea you submit on the day is quite different to what you actually talk about when you step on the stage. So for me, within that first week of meeting all of the other cohort, the other 11 speakers, bouncing ideas around, talking about them, what I realized was that there was one part of my talk that I'd mentioned in that application video around that designing for mental health and as a combat tool for what people are calling a loneliness epidemic. People are closed off, they're not connecting, they're on their phone a lot. There's always something to distract them. You work from home, COVID accelerated it. And I had this little snippet around how urban design in particular, but also buildings can support connection. So as I was bouncing these ideas around with my cohort, they zoned in on that. They said, that's the bit you seem really passionate about. You seem like you're talking about digital tools because that's your comfort zone, but really it's your conduit to talk about this other thing that you seem really interested in. Why don't you just talk about that? It was an amazing experience because they help you refine your ideas. So when I stepped out on the day, I told a much more personal story. I talked about finding my own place in Wellington. I talked about it earlier, coming to Wellington and not really feeling like I belonged. It was too much. It's too busy, but then really missing it. So I talked about the feeling of returning to Wellington. I talked about being an adult man in my 30s and having a shrinking friend group and what that does to people mentally. And I talked about finding solace in urban spaces. I talked about some of the ways that I connect to strangers just through things like, I use this example of like how I like to feed the birds on my lunch break. And people often come up and want to join in, people that I've never spoken to, that I've met before. But because you have a shared distraction, a shared focus, it creates a connection between strangers, which is really beneficial for people that feel lonely. And I've used Wellington as an example, especially the Wellington waterfront, of kind of urban design done right in the way that it is. This waterfront is this A to B between the train station and the city, but it's full of distractions and reasons to stop and linger and something that you can focus on that might conjure up a discussion between strangers. So yeah, very different to the AI is going to change architecture forever, but really rewarding and a really valuable experience with building up my own presentation skills because I'm no stranger to industry talks. And I thought I was pretty good at them, but this gave me a whole new perspective.
I was curious about that because, so before we go too far, TED is technology, education, and design, I think.
Engineering.
Engineering.
Yeah.
So I was curious. So you started talking about what skills the TED Talk gave you. So did that give you extra skills above what you thought you already had?
Yeah, it did. One, it got me back into the field of research, which is something that I hadn't done for a long time. And reading journals and academic writings, which is something that I haven't had to read for a long time, not since my university days. But really, the skills it gave me were around framing a presentation in a way that's engaging to an audience. And I had to present to a general audience, which was a different experience to my usual audience, which is other architectural technologists and BIM personnel. I'm a relatively frequent speaker at industry conferences, primarily built in Australia, but also Digicon, the ArchiPro Expo, Chulo Talks, things like that. And it gave me this perspective on framing my presentations from the audience perspective, making them more personal. It was a real challenge. If you're wired like me, you tend to just go into a presentation or a report or whatever it is and outline the facts. These are the facts. This is the information you need to know, but that's not always engaging. What you need to do is show the audience why you're passionate about those facts and that information, because enthusiasm and excitement is infectious. And if you're excited about technology and you're portraying that in your talk, then your audience is excited about technology.
So the TED Talk seems to have come towards the end of your Warren and Mahoney.
Yeah, that was one of the catalysts for opening up a few new avenues for me, which I won't get into just now because I'm not ready to report what I'm going to do next. But
that wasn't what I was expecting. Okay, so let's wrap up your career because I'd love to have you back and love to talk about BIM in particular.
Yeah.
You know so much about BIM. But looking back, is there some lesson that you could give to students that would help them in developing their career or help them right now as a student?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, over my time, I interviewed many students that we took on. And the thing that I always look for is that eagerness to learn, that eagerness to grow, to be a sponge, to take on every piece of information you can find, and also to be excited about everything. When you're starting out in your career, you're going to do a few things that feel a bit boring or uninteresting. You might be doing toilet calculations. You might be tidying up the materials library. You might need to write a report you don't want to do, or follow up on a bunch of code and checking stairs and making sure they're compliant. All these things that are absolutely vital to architecture, but may not be the most fun jobs. I would say finding a reason to be excited about even those things is really important, because the person that is really excited to do toilet calcs because they've never done them before and it's an opportunity to learn something that they didn't already know is so valuable.
I love the phrase you used earlier on. The people that are proud of their work do work they are proud of. And I think that's a great phrase. And to me, that would be a great phrase for a student.
Yeah.
You work you're proud of, regardless. I've done stair calcs. I've done
Be proud of those toilet calcs.
I did a project with probably 50, 60 stairs, each one different. But yeah, you're proud of that work. So I guess the lesson for the student is whatever you do, be proud of the work you do.
Yeah.
Do work that you're proud of.
Yeah.
I love that phrase. I really appreciate you telling me that phrase because I think it's a fantastic one. So I'd say thank you very much. I'd love to have you back to do the BIM, to talk about BIM. And I really appreciate your time. So thank you very much, Jake. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really appreciate it.